be seated. Just one quick note of explanation. Leon was much too kind and much too generous, and so he would not throw me under the bus. The song before prayer was the song Leon had selected to be the song before communion. The song in the order of worship that was supposed to be the song before communion was last Sunday's song before communion. And the song Leon chose to be the song before prayer is somewhere in Cyber Never Neverland. So the order of worship was a little bit out of kilter at the first part this morning because the man that typed it up didn't do such a great job typing it up. And as I said, Leon was much too kind to throw me under the bus for that, but I'll take responsibility for it. And I'll take 40 lashes with a piece of wet spaghetti over it. We're glad you're here. The author of the Hebrew letter in our text is writing to a group of Jewish Christians. And here's what Hebrews chapter 12 and verses 1 and 2 has to say. Wherefore, seeing that we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus as the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of God. You see, these Jewish Christians that the writer is addressing here, they have found their new life that they've entered in on to be difficult. It's not easy. In fact, they're finding this new life as Christians to be a life that's actually full of difficulties. They're being persecuted. They're being robbed of their goods. There are bitter foes within and without, and some of these Hebrew Christians are therefore greatly discouraged. More than one of them is actually half persuaded that their conversion has been a huge mistake. And many of these Hebrew Christians are looking back, and they're looking longingly to their old way of life. And they wonder, should we just renounce Christianity as being a futility? And so it is to hearten and to encourage these saints that the author writes the Hebrew letter. And he reminds them that their crucified Master is God's supreme revelation. And he urges them to hold fast to their profession of faith, and he warns them against falling from the grace of God. In chapter 11, God's hall of fame of the faithful, the Hebrew writer calls to the witness stand saint after saint after saint. And Abraham and Moses and Noah and all of these saints of old give testimony to the value of faith. They give testimony to the reality of things that are not seen. And the writer urges them, do not lose courage. In fact, what did he say? He says, lay aside every weight, lay aside the sin that doth so easily beset us, and let's run with patience the race that is set before us. But he does more than that. He does more than urge upon them the necessity and the importance of being loyal to their faith. He gives them, in our text, some very definite, helpful direction for living the Christian life. He tells them how they can be sure to win. He tells them how they can make their life count in the very finest fashion. Let's be honest with ourselves. Let's be honest before God. We often find this business of living the Christian life to be challenging. We often find that there are those in positions of authority even that ridicule the faith of Christian people. And there are those who, when we speak out against sin, they like to engage in name-calling. If we preach against sin, they want to accuse us of bigotry. If we preach against sin, we're engaging in hate speech. The directions given by the writer of Hebrews are still as pertinent in the 21st century as they were in the first century. And we would do well to listen to this experienced saint. Because he gives them, and he gives us, instructions on how to make a success of Christian living. Because the very first thing he says, seeing we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. He's just finished that 11th chapter and talked about all those heroes of faith. He said, we've got all of these witnesses of the value of faith. He says, since we've got all these witnesses of faith, let's lay aside all of our weights. Let's lay aside sin that besets us and let us run. Being a Christian is a strenuous thing. Being a Christian is a very exacting business. And what he's doing here is doing his very best to encourage these faltering saints that have been Hebrews. But he's not going to encourage them by concealing the facts. He does not do like so many today, and being a Christian is going to be the easiest way you've ever gotten through life. Everything's going to come up sunshine and roses, and everything's going to be wonderful. He does not make an appeal to their cowardice. And he does not make an appeal to their love of ease. He appeals to things in them that are heroic. He quite frankly tells them following Jesus Christ is going to be a conflict. It's a race to be run, and it means there's a stubborn battle that's going to have to be fought. And saying that, he is in harmony with every teaching of the New Testament. When Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus, he said, put on the whole armor of God. He said, if you put on the whole armor of God, you'll be able to stand against the craftiness and the wiles of the devil. Beloved, there are outward and visible foes to Christianity that are strong and powerful. But as the writer warns us, those are nothing compared to the foes, the enemies that are spiritual and unseen. Our wrestling is not against flesh and blood. And we are therefore to put on the whole armor of God so we can stand firm in the day of battle. And having fought the battle through to the finish, then we will be able to remain victors. Paul's words are in harmony with the teachings of Jesus. You remember one time someone came to Jesus and said, Lord, are there few that be saved? You know what Jesus said? He said, strive to enter the straight gate. Have you ever thought about that word strive? That word strive is a muscular word. That word strive is a word with panting breath and grimy hands. That word strive is a word whose face is flecked with blood. That word strive. It's a word that's at home on the athletic field. As Christians, we are to strive as we would strive in a game. It's also a word that is at home on the field of battle. We are to strive as if we were in a deadly conflict. That word strive is a word that finds its home in Gethsemane. When Jesus was there in the garden the night of his betrayal before he was seized by the Roman soldiers, can you see Jesus by an eye of faith dropping to his knees in prayer, striving in prayer to the point that sweat, as if it were great drops of blood, fell into the dirt at his feet? The writer says, let us strive. Or Jesus said, let us strive. The writer says, let us run the race. Run. That word speaks of white-hot earnestness. To make life count anywhere, we have to give it our very best. And making our life count as Christians is certainly no exception. But guess what? I am well aware that this is not the impression that anyone would get from looking at the average church in our land today. If a visitor came among our churches from some other planet, they would likely not be greatly impressed with our earnestness, our sincerity, or our commitment. They would see likely very little of the ardor of the Crusaders, and they would likely not see the grim determination of soldiers going into battle. And that is one thing that accounts most glaringly for a great deal of our failure. You remember the old fable of the tortoise and the hare? An indifferent hare, no matter how fleet-footed, is always going to lose the race to a tortoise who's in earnest and serious enough to keep running at his very best. There is a race that is set before us. And that implies there's a goal out there. And we've got to run before the goal and run toward the goal that is set before us. The problem is so many of us, sometimes, as we run, are more like Roy Riegels and Jim Marshall than we are the way that Jesus wants us to be. Let us run looking to Jesus, not looking to Jim Marshall and Roy Riegels. Do you know who they were? Roy Riegels played for the University of California in the 1929 Rose Bowl against the Rambling Wreck from Georgia Tech. And he scooped up a fumble and immediately ran toward his own goal line. Fortunately, one of his teammates was faster than he was and caught him at about the 3-yard line and tackled him. But then when the Cal Bears attempted to punt, Georgia Tech got a safety and it eventually won the game 8-6. The margin of victory was the safety that came about because Roy Riegels ran the wrong way. In 1964, the Minnesota Vikings were playing the San Francisco 49ers, and a defensive lineman from Minnesota by the name of Jim Marshall did the very same thing. Except he scooped up the fumble, nobody caught him, and he ran 66 yards and scored a touchdown for the opposing team. Our goal is salvation. Our goal is Jesus Christ. We look toward the goal of finishing the race, looking to Jesus, and we are to run the race that is set before us. And we are to run that race stripped of everything that handicaps us. It's only reasonable to be stripped of every handicap. It's just plain common sense. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin that doth so easily beset us. Our supreme goal, the main thing, the most important thing is to win the race. Nothing else really matters. And everything that's going to be of help in winning the race of the Christian life we take with us. And everything that's going to hinder us needs to be cast aside. And we ought to be willing to do that. To cast aside things that hold us back, things that hold us down, in order that we can win that incorruptible crown. Over and over again. That's what athletes do. They lay aside the things that hinder them so that they can win a crown or a badge or a ribbon or a trophy that is fleeting and of little worth. We've got to put aside sin. And that doesn't just mean the great glaring sins, the gross sins of passion. You know, the things that are mentioned like adultery, fornication, murder, stealing, robbery. You know, I don't think there's anybody in here that's going to go out and stick up a liquor store this afternoon and shoot somebody in the process. I don't think there's anybody in this room that's going to do that. But we've got to lay aside not just those great glaring sins of passion. It means every sin. Nothing hampers us more than unconfessed, unrepented sin in our lives. Nothing else so clips our spiritual muscles of strength than unconfessed, unrepented sin. Think about Samson of old, how adequate he was until he broke his vows of consecration. And when Samson broke those vows of consecration, his strength left him, and he became weak like any other man. We put aside every sin and every weight. What are you talking about? What is a weight? A weight is something that's not necessarily sinful in itself, but we can allow it to become sinful because of our wrong use of it. There are many things in our lives that are good in themselves, but we allow them to become weights because they become more important to us than the service of God. There are a great many things that ought to be helps that they end up becoming handicaps. One of the things that becomes an acid test for the things we do, the activities we engage in, and our amusements. Over the years, over the last 55 years since I started preaching, I've been asked a lot, "Preacher, is taking part in such and such an activity, is it right or is it wrong?" You know what the acid test is when someone asks me that question? Does it help you in living the Christian life? Does it hurt you in living the Christian life? Does it help you in running the Christian race? Does it hurt you in running the Christian race? Do you run the Christian race more swiftly? Is your influence as a Christian more productive after you've been to the boats than it was before you went to the boats? Is your Christian influence? Do you run the Christian race more swiftly? Is your influence upon others as a Christian, is it better after you've had a six-pack of beer or before you had a six-pack of beer? When is your Christian influence better? When is your Christian influence more productive? When can you better run that Christian race? Do you run the Christian race faster? Is your influence as a Christian, is it better after, fill in the blank, than it was before, fill in the blank? And that becomes the acid test. Is it right, is it wrong to take part in this activity? Whatever helps, grab it, cling to it. Whatever hurts, throw it away. How many are there right now, today, who could be swift runners, fleet of foot in the Christian race, going at a snail's pace because they don't apply this particular test? I read a story one time about an eagle over the hills of Tennessee, and a man killed a great giant American bald eagle, and he killed it with a charge of number 8 birdshot. And the hunter actually wondered how this king of the air that was usually so wild allowed him to get close enough to kill it with number 8 birdshot, because it was a magnificent bird. The wingspan measured 7 feet from tip to tip. When the hunter got the eagle and took a closer look, he found an old steel trap clinging to one of the eagle's legs. The trap didn't kill the eagle. The trap did not break the eagle's wings. But the trap so hindered the eagle flying and kept the eagle so close to the earth that it indirectly proved the death of that eagle. Oh my. What a parable that is for some of us. Have you ever thought about what a magnificent spread of wings that some of us have? Make it personal. Have I ever thought? Say within yourself, have I ever thought what a magnificent spread of wings that I might have? How that I might soar, and how grandly I might win the race and soar like an eagle for God. But we're weighted down. We remain close to the earth. And doing that, we become and remain an easy prey for our enemies. And that's not because we renounce our faith altogether. It's not even true because we insist upon clinging to open sin. It's because sometimes we just refuse to lay aside every weight. And all of us have them. I don't know what your weight is. You don't know what my weight is. I'm not talking about on the scales either. The name of my weight or your weight does not matter. It may be business. It may be too much social activity. It may be something that is actually altogether harmless in itself. But it robs us of our possibilities and makes us fail in the race. And then it becomes as tragic and as ruinous as open sin. We've got to run this race and lay aside every weight, and we've got to lay aside sin that besets us and run with patience. We've got to be stripped of all hindrances and run with patience. We've got to persist and exercise endurance. This life as a Christian, this Christian race is not a 100-yard dash. It's a cross-country marathon that stretches far and away off into the horizon. And if we would win this Christian race, we have to have patience. Patience with ourselves. So that we don't just give up in despair after our first failure. And we've got to have patience with others too. We've got to have patience with the failures and the limitations of others. And we have to have patience with God. I mean, after all, God doesn't always act like we think God should act. So the writer, in order to help us winning and keep the fine grace of patience, gives us some considerations. Some are losing patience. They're meeting with opposition. They're finding this Christian life to be distressingly difficult. Don't be impatient, the writer says. Don't be impatient. Opposition is to be expected. Any piece of driftwood can float downstream. Going against the current requires effort. Write this down. It's on the final exam. God did not ever promise us exemption from conflict. God did not promise that we'll be carried to the skies on flowery beds of ease. Jesus didn't even find life easy. He had to endure the contradictions of sinners. And if we find ourselves opposed, we've got to remember Jesus was opposed. If we find the race to be strenuous, uphill, we're only sharing the experience of all the saints who've gone before us. So we cannot allow the meeting of opposition to destroy our patience. And this writer urges them, they have no right to lose heart under such slight persecutions as they have had to suffer. Many of those whose names they honor, who are mentioned in Hebrews 11, were persecuted even unto death. But they did not lose patience. They kept their patience. They died in the faith. Don't give up, he says. You haven't gone the limit. You haven't resisted unto blood. Before you quit, before you say there's nothing to Christianity, give it a fair test. If you have staked your life on Jesus, are you listening? If you have staked your life on Jesus and Jesus has failed you, you have a right to be impatient. But not until then. And he encourages them to have patience. He says, suffering is not a mark of God's displeasure. It's a mark of sonship. My son, despise not the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. If you're finding life a bit stormy, it's because God is dealing with you as His own children. And it's a mark of His love and not His forgetfulness. Sometimes God has to discipline us. You know, many years ago, J.R. would say, son, this is going to hurt me a lot worse than it's going to hurt you. And then I would hear a belt clearing the loops of a pair of pants in 1.2 seconds. And I would feel the wrath of that belt. And I thought to myself, you're right. It's hurting me. It ain't hurting you a bit. That was many years ago. Many years ago. I would say to two young boys, son, this is going to hurt me worse than it's going to hurt you. And they would hear the sound of a belt clearing the loops in a pair of pants in 1.2 seconds. And they were so mouthy, they would just say, yeah, Daddy, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Well, that just caused it to hurt me a little worse and them a little worse. And now then, bringing it up today, I hear that boy that said that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard say to his own sons, this is going to hurt me worse than it hurts you. For whom the Lord loveth, He chasteneth. God deals with us as His children. Suffering is not necessarily an evil thing. It may be a means for great good. The tenderest hearts you'll ever see are usually those hearts that have been broken. The choicest souls you'll ever find are those that have been to Gethsemane for their schooling. So be patient. And God will kiss your tears into jewels, and God will change your sorrows into songs. Looking unto Jesus, he said. That's the final direction that the writer gives for running this race. Looking to Jesus. We are literally to look away from everything else and look to Jesus as the author and finisher of our faith. We don't fix our eyes upon our assets. We don't fix our eyes upon our liabilities. We fix our eyes upon Jesus. You remember Peter's venture on the water? Lord, if it's you, bid me come to you on the water. And Peter stepped over the side of the boat and started walking toward Jesus. And as long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, what did Peter do? He walked on the water. And Peter took his eyes off Jesus and he went swimming. We look to Jesus as our example. We don't run the race looking for hypocrites that exist in churches. We don't look to those that have given up and quit and abandoned the enterprise. Because to look in that direction is to run in that direction. We don't look at some faulty church member. We don't look, you don't even run the race looking at the preacher. We run the race looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. We need to look at Jesus. An example is well enough in its place. You and I need more than an example. And Jesus is more than an example. He is our constant helper. And He is our Savior. An example, and only an example, can sometimes be very discouraging and depressing. It would be quite useless for Shakespeare to write Hamlet's soliloquy and tell me, now you go and write like that because I've given you an example. It wouldn't happen. It would also be totally absurd for Bijan Robinson to lower his head, go through the middle of the opposing team's defense for a 50-yard touchdown run, flip me the football and say, go down and do likewise. You're kidding, right? We need something more than an example. It's useless for Jesus to walk from the manger of the cross and tell me to live like that. Jesus has to do more than set me an example. He has to save me. He has to keep me. And He has to give me the power to follow Him. He's promised to do all that. And that's a promise He's going to keep. But for Him to do all that for me, He's got to be the Lord and Master of my life. All of my life. When I come to Him in simple trusting faith, repenting of everything that's sin in my life, confessing His name before men and being buried in the waters of baptism, that makes Him Lord and Master of my life. But then after I've done that, sometimes I don't live His kind of life. And I have to come back to Him. I don't know what the needs are of your life this morning. I don't know what's going on in your world. Is there something we can help you with? Is there some need in your life that we can help you with? Whether it's to make Jesus Lord of your life for the very first time or make Him Lord once again in your life or some other need. This is your opportunity to come. Let us know what we can do to help you as to get this